For years, the US-China trade war has been presented as a plain dispute over factories and supply chains. But as we'll reveal to you in this video, it's worse than you might imagine. A battle for global supremacy disguised as an economic disagreement. $380 billion in US tariffs slapped on Chinese goods, a move so monumental it disrupted supply chains worldwide. Yet, there's one uncomfortable reality everyone almost overlooked. The trade deficit barely changed. China's exports adapted, found new buyers, and shifted gears. If these tariffs didn't cripple China's economy, then what was their real purpose? Well, I'll explain this in just a second. But Washington's true aim might not just be economic leverage, but to deliberately stall Beijing's rise by cutting off its access to critical technologies that would shape the future. This video will expose the shocking truth behind the trade war's real casualties. By the end, you'll understand how Washington's economic offensive set off a chain reaction nobody saw coming. Here's the thing, the economic rationale behind tariffs has crumbled under scrutiny. Politicians promised that tariffs would revive US manufacturing jobs, but the reality tells a different story. As of early 2025, US manufacturing employment has plateaued at around 12.8 million jobs, showing little growth since 2018. Meanwhile, Chinese exports reached an astounding $6.1 trillion in 2024, further solidifying the resilience of China's industrial ecosystem. The truth is, tariffs were never really about economics. They were about safeguarding US technological supremacy. The CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, with its $52 billion in subsidies for domestic semiconductor production and strict export controls, laid bare the West's real strategy, decoupling critical technologies from China. This explains why the US has aggressively targeted companies like Huawei and Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, blacklisting them and cutting off their access to advanced chips. Yet, China's semiconductor imports surged to $385 billion in 2024, a 10.4% increase from the previous year, as Chinese firms stockpiled chips to counter tightening US sanctions. Despite these efforts, China's domestic chip production remains far behind global leaders. But the collapse of the rules-based trading system is perhaps the most overlooked consequence of the US-China trade war. When the World Trade Organization ruled in September 2020 that US tariffs violated global trade rules, the Trump administration ignored the decision, and the Biden administration upheld the policy. This marked a pivotal moment. The very country that built the post-World War II economic order was now dismantling it. Global trade growth, which averaged 5% annually before 2018, has only modestly rebounded to 2.7% in 2024 and is projected to reach 3.0% in 2025, according to the World Trade Organization. China's share of global payments in yuan has climbed steadily, reaching 4.74% of global transactions by mid-2024. Cross-border yuan settlements have surged as well, with total receipts and payments exceeding $7.2 trillion in 2023. We're witnessing a return to 1930s-style economic blocs, with the US and EU solidifying a techno-democratic alliance while China continues to expand its alternative systems, such as the digital Silk Road. But something unthinkable is unfolding right on America's doorstep. When the Trump administration invoked national security concerns to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian steel in 2018, Canadian steel exports to the US dropped by nearly 40% within months. But instead of retreating to Washington, Ottawa made a bold move eastward. By 2024, Canadian exports to China surged to $21.76 billion, with lithium and rare earth minerals for electric vehicles and missile guidance systems. And while the US pressured allies to ban Huawei's 5G technology, Canada only implemented partial restrictions. What's truly distressing, Pew Research data reveals Canadian approval of US leadership has dropped to 37% in 2024, down from 65% before the tariffs. Shifting our focus now to Europe, cracks in the Western alliance are becoming impossible to ignore. Germany's economic giants, like BMW and BASF, now generate nearly 40% of their global revenues from China. When the US pushed for a full tech decoupling from China, Berlin responded by approving a record 3.8 billion euros in Chinese investments in Volkswagen EV operations during the first half of 2024. Meanwhile, French President Macron has been dropping hints about strategic autonomy, a diplomatic way of saying, "We're not America's sycophant." EU-China trade reached 739 billion euros in 2023, though it declined by 14% compared to 2022. European investment in China rebounded to 3.6 billion euros in greenfield projects in 2024, and this turns out to be a quiet rebellion against Washington's demands. The truth is that Europe's economic survival may increasingly depend on Beijing rather than Washington in the years ahead. But what if the greatest threat to the West isn't just China, but a rising axis powered by Russia's weapons, Iran's oil, and a shared mission to upend the global order? Here's the thing. Trade between China and Russia reached a record $244.8 billion in 2024, a modest increase from $240.1 billion in 2023. But this isn't simply about oil and gas. Moscow has become China's primary arms supplier, offering advanced missile technology in exchange for Chinese semiconductor smuggling, a calculated move to sidestep Western sanctions. The financial dynamics are shifting too. Over 70% of Russia-China trade is now conducted in yuan, a dramatic leap from just 3% in 2014. Add Iran to the equation, and a new axis is emerging. Chinese investment in Iran's oil infrastructure has mounted, with Belt and Road projects in the Middle East reaching $39 billion in 2024. Tehran supplies drones containing more Chinese components than Iranian ones. This might be the foundation of a parallel global system. It closely mirrors how the US built its Cold War alliances, and now China is deploying the same strategy with surgical precision. The real question isn't whether the axis will endure, it's how much it will disrupt Western dominance before the dust settles. Which begs the question, who's winning the long game here, and who are the losers? By the way, if you're enjoying watching, consider supporting our channel by hitting like and subscribing. It helps us bring even more content like this. Now, let's continue. One of the most unexpected outcomes of America's trade war has been the rise of new economic powerhouses in Asia and beyond. Vietnam's exports to the US skyrocketed by 325% since 2018, making Vietnam America's 8th largest trading partner. Walk through industrial parks in Hanoi today, and you'll find Chinese companies operating under Vietnamese names, shipping goods labeled "Made in Vietnam" straight to American shelves. Mexico has also quietly risen in prominence. By 2024, it surpassed China as America's top trading partner, with bilateral trade reaching $799 billion. Here's the kicker. Over $26 billion of that was in tech manufacturing investments, all while Mexico managed to maintain strong trade ties with China. The irony here is that Washington's efforts to weaken Beijing have inadvertently turned Southeast Asia into the next global manufacturing hub, with Chinese companies still pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And with that said, who's actually paying the price for this economic war? And how long can they afford to? Well, the reality is that these tariffs are costing US households an extra $4,200 annually in higher prices, adding up to a whopping $170 billion per year. Small manufacturers have been hit especially hard. First, Chinese retaliation targeted US agricultural exports. Then, the rising cost of imported components dealt another blow. Take the steel industry, for example. While tariffs saved 8,700 steel jobs, they cost 75,000 auto sector jobs due to soaring material prices. And the policies haven't changed. The Biden administration upheld 92% of Trump's China tariffs while introducing new tech restrictions. Sounds like a bipartisan agreement that America's future depends on economic conflict with China, regardless of the collateral damage. What's even more troubling is that after 5 years of trade warfare, the US manufacturing sector still hasn't returned to its pre-2008 levels. And while Washington and Beijing clash over global dominance, the global south is silently emerging as the decisive battleground. See, China's Belt and Road investment in Africa reached $121.8 billion in 2024, with projects like Kenya's railway debt and Zambia's copper mines serving as stark reminders of the risks of new era influence. But here's what Western media might not already know. 35 African nations now trade more with China than with their former European colonizers. Latin America's shift is even more dramatic. Brazil's President Lula recently visited Beijing to sign 15 new trade deals, openly criticizing US protectionism in the process. Even more troubling, China has overtaken the US as South America's top trading partner, with commerce hitting $466.62 billion in 2024. As Washington remains fixated on its rivalry with China, Beijing is quietly building alliances that could redefine the balance of power for decades to come. But wait, are we repeating the 1930s? History's greatest tragedy is how often we fail to learn from it. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930 caused a 66% collapse in global trade, turning an economic downturn into the Great Depression. Today's decoupling efforts are eerily similar, but with an even more dangerous twist. Cross-border investment flows declined by 8% in 2024, and economists are sounding the alarm. We're not just repeating the trade wars of the 1930s, we're escalating them with tech blockades and financial sanctions. The US Treasury's foreign asset freezes have triggered a 189% surge in central bank gold purchases as nations scramble to reduce their reliance on the dollar. What we're witnessing is a tectonic shift in the global order. Tiny fractures are forming beneath the surface, and if ignored, they could erupt into seismic change. To wrap things up, the world's not ready for such a change. Let's be honest, this was never about tariffs or trade deficits. At its core, it's about control. The US believed it could contain China through economic pressure, but instead, it has sparked a global realignment that's strengthening Beijing's position. You see, China's yuan has overtaken the dollar as Russia's most traded currency. India is buying Russian oil in yuan, and Saudi Arabia is considering yuan-denominated oil contracts. America's weaponization of economic tools has backfired, accelerating the very multipolar world Washington sought to prevent. And here's the most unsettling part: we're still in the early stages. As AI, quantum computing, and clean tech emerge as the next battlegrounds, the intensity of economic warfare will only increase. Whether it's Canada's lithium deals with China or Europe's energy dependence on Russia, the alliances forming today will shape the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. Tell us what you think in the comments section. We want to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.